Okay, not sure what's happening. Anyway, now we are back live on Facebook. So welcome if you've just joined us on Facebook. We're going to start in a minute with Dr. Ben Franta. We're just getting our tech all sorted out. So we're on Zoom and Facebook. Oh, I just saw my daughter log on. There we go. She's there. Oh, I am.
Hi. I'll mute myself.
So I think that we are ready to go. 5:01. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for logging on today. If any of you don't know us, Divest Princeton is a grassroots coalition of students, faculty, alumni, and staff. And we are calling on Princeton University to divest from fossil fuels and to reinvest responsibly. We would also love to have you join us. If you are in the Princeton community, we need more of you. So please check out our website, divestprinceton.com. Please follow us on social media, and please get all your friends to follow us too. So we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Benjamin Franta with us. And Dr. Franta, if you don't know him yet, is a JD PhD candidate at Stanford Law School and the Stanford Department of History. He's studying the history of climate science, climate disinformation, and fossil fuel producers. He has a separate PhD in applied physics from Harvard, and he's also a former research fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, The New Republic, Project Syndicate, and elsewhere. He writes on fossil fuel divestment and the history of the fossil fuel industry. So although he's Dr. Franta and is about to become Dr. Franta, I've been calling him Ben, so I hope that's okay. We'll keep calling you Ben. And we know you have some slides that are going to help us analyze and understand the renewed relationship between Princeton and Exxon. So we'll see if we can do that screen share now. This is the moment of truth. Thank you, Ben.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you. Thank you for having me. And I do have a short presentation just to kick us off. And so I will share my screen. It looks like because I'm an attendee, I'm not able to share the screen. So if maybe I can be made a co-host or something.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you. Share screen. Boom. Okay. Can you see this?
Yep, looks great.
Perfect. Okay. So this is just to get us started. It's not a long presentation, and I want us to have a lot of time to have discussion. So yes, my name is Ben Franta, and I'm in the law school at Stanford in the history department. And I came here about 4 years ago, and I began studying the history of fossil fuel companies and climate science and the fossil fuel companies' campaigns of climate disinformation, how they have delayed public policy about climate change. And before I even came to Stanford, I was at Harvard, and I was involved in the fossil fuel divestment campaign there, and I began to notice that the few professors that were outspoken against divestment tended to receive funding from the fossil fuel industry. And at the time, I just noticed that as a correlation, an interesting pattern, and began to be interested in that dynamic. And then since I've come here and studied the history of the industry, I've learned that industry funding of academia is a standard strategy that regulated industries that produce damaging or polluting products use in order to defend themselves against liability, to buy goodwill, and so on. So the first thing I want to do is just read this text, and I don't know if you're able, maybe type in the chat if you're able, what year you think this was written in. see. And are you able to do that? Let's see, chat. Okay, we have a few guesses. 1960, 1965, 1980, 1990, 2000. We're gonna hit all the years pretty soon. And usually I would ask you why you chose that year, because that's the interesting part, is the rationale. But I don't think I can do that very easily here, unless you type it in. But these are some good guesses. So the actual answer is 1978. And so many of you are very close. It's from a book called The Regulation Game, Strategic Use of the Administrative Process. It's basically about how industries can game federal regulatory agencies and use them to their advantage. And it makes sense that this was written around this time. In the 1970s, many regulatory statutes were enacted, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, occupational safety and health, and so on. And so the growth of the regulatory state saw a counter movement by many industries to develop strategies to avoid regulation. And this is one of them in black and white text, co-opt the experts by giving them research grants. So many industries benefit from giving funding to academics in numerous ways. So one is preventing academics from testifying or writing against the industry, as that excerpt stated. Also creating a favorable view of the industry among academics, select which academics become prominent, because of course, if you receive a lot of funding for your work, you're going to become more prominent in the field. Shaping research topics and directions. This is really important. We can talk more about that later. Obtaining early access to research directions and results, or in other words, monitoring research. This is something that we know the fossil fuel industry has been doing on climate science since the late 1970s from its internal documents. Recruiting and advertising to students, positioning the industry as a good or constructive actor to the public and to the courts. And before this talk, one of you sent me a Twitter link to Exxon advertising its support of the Andlinger Center at Princeton. And this is a perfect example of Exxon using that funding as a way to advertise itself to the public and create the image of itself as a good faith actor. It creates and sustains the "we need more research" narrative, that climate change is a really hard problem and that we need to do more research before we can expect any sort of major progress on the issue. Continuing to fund academics helps sustain that narrative. And in general, many industries do this. They will fund safe research that does not threaten the industry, and they'll avoid funding dangerous research or research that could be threatening to the industry. And a wonderful example of this is the huge amount of research in medicine and health that the tobacco industry funded for many years, funding research on essentially all the causes of disease other than tobacco: stress, heredity, prions, misfolded proteins, but not funding the research on what does its products do to people. And this, again, it creates this narrative that takes attention away from the industry. So this is just a list, it's just a partial list of the many ways that industry benefits from these funding arrangements. Sometimes the benefits are advertised by the university. This is just one example. It's from the MIT Joint Program, which does a lot of research and work on climate-related policy. And I just found this online, but there are many other examples. But here you can see if you provide funding to the program, you can obtain these different benefits. You can sponsor customized research projects. So there, the companies are shaping the research directly. And of course, if somebody's doing research on one thing, they're not doing research on another. You can obtain early access to research results and so on. So this is just an example of that. And so if anybody says that there are no kickbacks to the industry for the funding, that's wrong. So it's advertised that the industry does get that. So, you know, this isn't unique to the fossil fuel industry. The tobacco industry has done this for a long time, and as a result, public health scientists often have a much more familiar relationship with the problems that can arise from industry funding. We've seen the similar dynamics with the sugar industry. Again, funding research that points the finger at other industries, not the sugar industry. There's examples from the lead industry. There are examples in the pharmaceutical industry. There are many. So I think this is an important context to understand that when we talk about oil industry funding in universities for climate research or energy research or energy policy research, you know, it's not as if the idea of conflict of interest is new. This is a well-recognized concept in lots of other fields, but sort of curiously, it's not often recognized within the climate and energy research space. And in my opinion, that should change. So I wanted to just give an example of the sorts of public relations benefits that the industry receives. Now, I went through and I read the director of the center, Lin Lu, her op-ed defending the Exxon's sponsorship. And what I found interesting was that almost all of it contained standard industry talking points that deflect attention away from the industry or that benefit the industry in other ways. So here, for example, emphasizing the difficulty of replacing fossil fuels and emphasizing the benefits of fossil fuels. And that's again, just a common way to frame the problem in a way that benefits the industry, because it normalizes the concept for the audience that progress should not be expected quickly, and it complicates the morality of the problem by saying fossil fuels are good and emphasizing the benefits of fossil fuels. Here, shifting the blame to population growth or any other factors. And really, fundamentally, this argument conflates energy with fossil fuels. It says the population of the earth will grow, therefore we'll need more energy. And the implicit suggestion is that therefore we need more fossil fuels. But of course, energy is not equal to fossil fuels. There are other sources of energy. Again, shifting the blame to energy poverty, saying many people in the world do not have access to much energy, which is true. And saying they need more energy, and the implicit suggestion is we need more fossil fuels. Again, emphasizing difficulty of the problem, emphasizing complexity, emphasizing that progress will be slow. And in all of this, in this whole paragraph, there's no mention of fossil fuels. It says that all economic sectors must change, transportation, buildings, but nothing about fossil fuels. So to me, that's a little strange, because the majority of anthropogenic CO2 comes from fossil fuels. So it's another great example of industry-friendly framing. There's the carbon capture sequestration narrative, which asserts that we have to have it. And if we have to have it, then we have to have fossil fuel companies. what's ignored is the long history of carbon capture and storage or sequestration, its cost, and I'll talk a little bit more about the history later. Again, framing, I felt for you because this was sort of a backhanded compliment. Framing climate change as a technical, not a political problem, describing Divest Princeton as passionate, which is sort of a euphemism for emotional, and advocates, as in you're biased and not objective. And then the Andlinger Center, engineers and scientists are the rational ones, the ones who are solving problems and so on. I mean, and this is, the industry has framed climate change as a scientific problem, not a political problem, for decades, while at the same time being very involved in political lobbying and public relations disinformation campaigns to delay progress, essentially. So, you know, this is also, I just found this interesting as well. And then framing fossil fuel companies as leaders, trying to decarbonize as if they're doing everything they can to stop producing and selling fossil fuels, and there's waiting for the solutions to be developed and handed to them. And of course, this is completely out of touch with what has actually occurred over the last 40 years of climate history. The fossil fuel companies understood the problem many, many decades ago, and we know from their internal documents that they knew renewable energy was the only solution that would make sense for this problem. And then they proceeded to block essentially all public policies that would promote renewable energy and end up replacing their own products. So the idea of framing fossil fuel companies as just essentially limited by the technology and not actually actively blocking the problem is wrong. And again, I'll kind of move through this quickly. Presenting fossil-friendly solutions like carbon capture, sequestration, efficiency, which it's hard to argue against being more efficient, but it does not replace fossil fuels. It's not sufficient by itself. Hydrogen, again, people will argue about whether hydrogen will be a major part of the energy economy in the future, but sure. Today, nearly all hydrogen comes from fossil fuels, from reforming natural gas, and so on. So you see, it's instead of a frame that emphasizes replacing fossil fuels, you have another frame that offers a wide variety of solutions that involve the continuation of fossil fuels. And then there's this assertion of research independence. Now, I have to say that just because it's asserted does not mean it's true. I've had conversations with the directors of the Stanford GCEP, Global Climate and Energy Project here, which was funded heavily by Exxon as well. And they assert to me that they are independent, but contractually they're not independent. In that case, the funders had contractual power to approve the research project. So it was not in fact independent. So when you hear an assertion of independence, I think it's still worth looking into what does the sponsorship contract actually stipulate. And then of course, acting like industry funding is necessary in order for companies like Exxon to use the research results. That of course is not logically true. And then I'm almost done, I promise. This was such a perfect article for this analysis. Asserting fossil fuel companies are energy companies. Now this is one of the oldest, most common strategies of misdirection by the fossil fuel industry. That they are not in fact fossil fuel companies, that they are energy companies. Now this is factually wrong because their products are fossil fuels. They spend over the last decade, the oil majors have spent around 99% of their capital expenditures on fossil fuels and only about 1% on other energy sources. So to say that they are a broad, diversified energy company is just factually wrong. But it distracts, it deflects away from the problematic nature of these companies. So what's ignored here? And I'm going to move some things around. So one thing is that Exxon internally considered carbon capture and sequestration in the early 1980s and rejected it as being too expensive, and seeing energy conservation or shifting renewable energy sources as the only solutions that might make sense for climate change. And that's Exxon's words, not mine. Now, of course, that was many, many decades ago, but the question is CCS cheaper? Is CCS plus fossil fuels cheaper than renewables? And that's sort of the main question in terms of market competitiveness. That's just ignored, and the necessity of CCS is simply asserted with no evidence in Lin Lu's op-ed. Ignored, $200 million a year still spent by the fossil fuel industry to obstruct and block public policies to deal with climate change. That whole political reality, that's ignored by Professor Lu's op-ed. And as I mentioned earlier, the oil majors are spending 99% of their CapEx, or capital expenditures, on fossil fuels, and only about 1% on low carbon systems. So to act like these are diversified energy companies is, again, misleading. It's not true. So I went back and I looked at the industry's internal documents to see what I could find on this topic of industry funding. And this is one from 1998. This is the American Petroleum Institute's strategy memo for how to defeat the Kyoto Protocol and how to stop all climate policy going forward. And a big part of it was getting involved with science. So here, I just screenshotted the document. Identifying and establishing cooperative relationships with all major scientists whose research supports our position. Also with the scientific organizations like meteorologists, geophysicists. You might have seen that the fossil fuel companies have been major funders of the American Geophysical Union, and that has recently become controversial, but this has also been carried out. Developing opportunities to maximize the impact of scientific views consistent with ours, with Congress, the media, and other key audiences. And this is what you have when the industry funded and industry friendly research directors use their voice to promote industry friendly talking points in op-eds, in congressional testimony, and so on. And then in plain black and white, monitoring and serving as an early warning system for scientific developments with the potential to impact the climate debate, pro and con. So the industry finds value in monitoring who's doing what research. Are there threatening results coming down the road? Are there ways that we can head them off? And I won't read through all of this, but this is just more. And I'm sorry because I'm not able to see all of my letters here, my excerpts here because of the Zoom. But anyway, I'll let you just read that. One of them says, produce, distribute a steady stream of climate science information to science writers, produce, distribute via syndicate and directly to newspapers nationwide, steady stream of op-ed columns and letters to the editor authored by scientists. So what we see here is the industry wants to use scientists as essentially public relations spokespeople because scientists have so much credibility. So I made a partial list of energy and climate related research centers across the US that were founded as being majority fossil fuel industry funded, in some cases entirely. So here's the Carbon Mitigation Initiative at Princeton, one of the very early ones. Now remember, that internal memo, that strategy memo was written in 1998. So within a few years, we see a large uptick in these climate research centers at universities funded by the oil industry. Some at Stanford in the early 2000s, Global Climate Energy Project, which I mentioned earlier, even the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford was majority funded by a very wealthy business person who made his money in oil and gas. MIT Energy Initiative, one of the major research centers in the country. And then there are some other ones there as well. And then these are other research centers that they weren't necessarily founded as being oil industry majority funded, but they have since become funded significantly by the oil industry. So we see a lot of the policy research centers on this list, like the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum, the MIT Joint Program, which I mentioned earlier. Many of the policy programs at Harvard, which of course are very influential, the Environmental Economics Program, Project on Climate Agreements, the Consortium for Energy Policy Research, and then I put the Andlinger Center on there as well, which I understand was founded in 2008 and has been funded by Exxon since 2015. That's my current understanding. So this is an example of the sort of analysis that can be done to get a better idea of the fossil fuel industry ties. So here's just an example for the Consortium for Energy Policy Research at Harvard that I made. So the red dots are the academic centers, the gray dots are people, and the black dots are fossil fuel interests. So if we start at the center red dot, that's the research center itself. Its funder is Shell Oil Company, below it. If we stay below, it's housed at the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Kennedy School. And that is funded by two people, Bijan and Sharmin Mossavar Rahmani. And then their ties are being the CEO, chairman, director of petroleum company, director of another petroleum company, past founder and CEO of another petroleum company, and on the board of a couple of other petroleum companies. And then if we go above to the top part of the diagram, the faculty director of this center is Bill Hogan at Harvard. And he's given testimony for BP, Amoco, Shell, Exxon, etc. Past member of the National Petroleum Council, past director of the Gas Research Institute. His professorship is sponsored by Apache Corporation. And also he's the past director of another program that was funded by the oil industry. So it can get a little complicated, but it takes time to find all of these relationships, but making these sorts of analyses can help to illuminate all of the different industry ties with the research center. And the fact, in my opinion, is that these ties should be transparent, that it shouldn't require somebody to go digging around to find them, because if somebody's doing research in energy policy or climate change related matters, then relationships with the fossil fuel industry, which is the primary cause of climate change, those should be disclosed and those should be transparent. That's my opinion. But that's just an example. So there's not a lot of literature, which is too bad, but also means there's a big opportunity here to do some original research and have it matter. Really one of the only publications I know of is this report from the Center for American Progress, Big Oil Goes to College, and that's from 2010. So it's already 10 years old. And so any research that you do and bring to public attention is going to be a contribution. So here are just my conclusions based on what I've seen in this space so far, that fossil industry funding of the research we think that we're relying on to save us from climate change is pervasive. It's not widely recognized by the public. In fact, when I write about this, people are usually shocked. And there are many benefits to the fossil fuel industry, and we should think about whether the world is actually benefiting from these arrangements or not, or how much. And so I don't know what the next steps are. That's sort of for the discussion, but compiling information from whatever sources that you can, including websites, news records, interviewing people is very illuminating, and people will often talk. Trying to examine how does the funding shape attitudes about fossil fuel divestment, for example. We recently had a meeting at Stanford of the faculty senate, and many of the faculty who were funded by the fossil fuel industry admitted that they didn't want to support divestment because they were afraid that the oil industry might take away its funding. So that's an admission that the funding is having an effect on people's attitudes about climate policies and approaches. What's being studied, and what's really important to look at is what isn't being studied. It's pretty rare that industry funding will actually change the results of a research study. That's very dangerous because it's fraudulent. But what is a lot easier is to influence what is studied and what isn't. What policies are being studied, what policies the industry doesn't like aren't being studied, and technologies and so on. And then bringing to public attention. And, I think what I always go back to is, would we want the tobacco industry funding public health research? And the fact is they did, and they still do to some degree, but do we want a majority? Would we want a majority of public health research funded by the tobacco industry? And I think, to me, the answer is obviously no. And I think for a lot of other people, it's also no. And it looks like a lot of the research being funded in climate and energy is being funded by the oil industry, and not just a little bit, a lot. So I think it's really important that the whole public, and the public's depending on this research for their welfare, that they are informed and have a voice. So that's all I have for that. And so I think we can go to discussion, question, answer, and so on. Let me unshare my screen.
Ben, that was fantastic. That was so illuminating. That was parsing what she said and showing the background to each point. It makes you read the op-ed in a completely different light. That was fantastic. This is now, I'm sure there are going to be many questions. I have one right off the bat. So in medical research, it's absolutely standard that every single author has to do a disclosure of potential conflicts of interest. That's just a standard. In academic writing about energy, you're saying that's not the case.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm still trying to figure out how to unshare my screen. Oh. Did it work? Let's see.
For me, it did. It worked for me.
Okay.
I see myself.
It worked.
It worked, okay.
So,
okay, oh, thank you.
Academic disclosure for energy science articles?
Yeah, so again, it's a little bit of an uncharted area, and this is sort of something that I don't have a definitive answer because I haven't analyzed all of the centers, but some things that I've noticed are that sometimes the funding is not disclosed, and sometimes it's only disclosed through a shell entity or an intermediate entity. So, for example, the research done at the Stanford Global Climate and Energy Project will will say this is supported by the Global Climate and Energy Project, but it doesn't say who supports the Global Climate and Energy Project.
Right.
And so my suspicion is that's probably fairly common to say this is supported by the Princeton Center for this or the Harvard Center for that. And when readers are reading that, that sounds very credible. But what's not being said is, well, what are the companies funding these centers?
So someone mentioned in the chat, really all the universities that are watching right now, we should all make one of those maps, mapping the funding and the links for our universities. And we should be asking our universities for full disclosure in terms of scientific articles published about energy. Okay. Another question, you talked a little bit about shifting the blame. So back in February, our president, Christopher Eisgruber, was asked about divestment, and his answer was, right now, Princeton doesn't have any plans for divestment. We make a difference in the world through our teaching and research and the quality of that teaching and research, rather than by taking a symbolic stance with our endowment. So do you think that divestment is symbolic? Does it have utility? Does it matter to the fossil fuel companies?
Yes. So I see there's two issues there. So one is that divestment is being falsely framed by the president, if I heard you correctly, as an either or proposition. It's saying we make a difference by teaching, therefore we're not going to divest. But the problem with that argument is that it presumes that you can only do one, that you can't do both, that it's an either or proposition, and it's not. And the research that has been done on what must happen to funding flows and investment in the fossil fuel industry in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement are clear. They all move in the same direction. They all show the same result, and they all say that investments must be drawn down from the fossil fuel industry if we're going to meet the Paris Agreement. And so that includes everybody. And you know, Stanford or Princeton does teach, of course, they do research, but Princeton also has an endowment. Princeton also is an institutional investor. And so, you know, if we're seeing that investors need to draw down in their investments in fossil fuels, that necessarily includes Princeton. And then there's the other question about symbolism. And of course, this is sort of used as a deflective rhetorical tool. Saying something is symbolic is sort of a euphemism for saying that it doesn't matter, which of course is wrong. We use symbols to communicate a lot of information in our society. And so, I mean, I think the truth is that divestment is symbolic, but it's not just symbolic. So when institutions divest, they're communicating about their values and what kind of institution they want to be, what they want the world to look like in the future. And that's all symbolic. That's all part of communicating a message, but they're also literally drawing money out from the fossil fuel industry. And as you know, I just mentioned, that's necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I would say it's both. I mean, it's symbolic, but it's not just symbolic. And the scale of the whole divestment movement globally is getting to be quite large. I mean, it's over $10 trillion in assets under management that so far have a divestment policy that they're subject to. So it's becoming what's called material, as in it matters to the bottom line to the fossil fuel companies. And some of them have said as such in their shareholder reports. So the companies themselves have admitted that divestment is not just symbolic, that it makes a material difference to them.
Great. I have one more question, and then we'll open it to some of the questions on chat. Going back to President Eisgruber back in February, he also said, you mentioned this a little bit about shifting blame. President Eisgruber said, I think in my view, it's not accurate to say that climate change is happening because of these big companies, fossil fuel companies that are somehow doing it to us. They're responding to a set of preferences that people have and act upon them. So what do you think about that strategy of it's not their fault, it's our fault?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, this argument ignores a lot of the evidence that is really well established about the behavior of the fossil fuel industry. You know, and it kind of presumes that fossil fuel companies are passive bystanders, which they are not. And this is a classic industry strategy as well. The tobacco industry, lots of industries that face public scrutiny, litigation, regulation. One of the ways they defend themselves is by presenting themselves as a passive, innocent bystander, and that they are simply reacting to the consumer that demands this product. And what that ignores is all the things that the industry does to affirmatively try to sell more products and prevent regulation of their product and so on. So, you know, in the case of the fossil fuel industry, it ignores the fact that we have internal documents now that show that the industry knew in great detail by the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s that its products would cause, in its own words, potential catastrophe. And it did not warn the public about that, which legally, some people would argue that it should have, and maybe the courts will decide that too. But they didn't warn the public about that. And in fact, instead, they did the opposite. They played down the threat. So they told the public not to worry about climate change. They told the public that it wouldn't be that bad if it happened. Spend a huge amount of money to block public policies to deal with climate change. And now we have, you know, much more damage as a result from that. And so, you know, the argument that the fossil fuel industry is simply a passive bystanders, you know, it's not supported by the historical evidence.
Okay, we have one question from the chat. A common talking point from friends who are invested in the energy industry or the fossil fuel industry and say that a massive switch to renewable energy isn't viable because it's weather dependent. It's the sun and the wind, we can't control them. What's the answer for that?
Yep. So it's of course true that some renewable sources of energy are intermittent. And you know, this is sort of a technical question. The analyses that I have seen indicate that a lot of renewables can be used before that becomes a major problem. And of course, there are ways to store that energy and level up and, well, essentially manage demand so that it better matches supply. So, you know, that's a technical question, but the important point is that should not prevent us from using a lot more renewables than we already use, you know? So if this becomes a problem once we hit, and I'm just pulling a number out here, but it's something on this order of magnitude, 50% renewables, then that shouldn't prevent us from getting to 50%. That's sort of my opinion. That's my take on that issue.
Well, it goes back a bit to your idea that we should be doing research on the issues that really need research rather than carbon sequestration and focusing on things like that. We have another question. Again, going back to mapping of connections, a sort of old boys network, and particularly thinking of these Ivy League universities, very prestigious. They, you know, so the people who are already heavily invested in fossil fuels, perhaps work there, are alumni. What do you think about the sort of linking into Wall Street as well? Is this a three-way, you know, fossil fuel industrial triangle?
Well, that's a great question. I'll just make the following comment, which is that in my experience talking to university trustees, trying to convince them of the wisdom of divestment. I think there is a cultural resistance to the idea of putting a certain investment as off limits. And, not all trustees have a vested interest in fossil fuels per se, although some do. In fact, many do, but not all of them do. But I think there is a sort of corporate board culture that wants to view the economy as driven by the consumer, and so no responsibility should be borne by the producers of products. And as long as it's legal to invest in, you should be able to invest in it. And that's an ideology, of course, but it's an ideology that is held by, I think, a lot of people who are on corporate boards, including university trustees are essentially on a corporate board. So, I'll just make that observation. That's sort of what I've noticed anecdotally. So I think there is an element there, the Wall Street mentality. And I think the way to address that is, one, to recognize that's where these people are often coming from, but they also have an interest in avoiding catastrophic climate change. And to do that, they really should be listening to scientific research that shows that you can't just keep investing in fossil fuels as we have been and expect the problem to be solved, that the investments have to change. And so I think that is slowly starting to get incorporated into people's worldviews, which is a good thing, but hopefully it will happen faster rather than slower.
I was just going to say, is there the possibility, unfortunately, we don't really have time for it, but is there a possibility of it's a generational shift? So younger trustees are maybe more open, but we sort of can't wait for, 20 years. Do you find younger is there a correlation between age and attitude toward divestment?
I don't know for sure, because I am tempted to say yes. I think younger people understand the political reality of climate change a lot more than older people do. So, for instance, when I'm helping to teach classes at Stanford, the undergraduate students, they get it. They understand the politics of climate change. They understand that lobbying goes on. They understand concepts like environmental justice, and the fact that some people are bearing the brunt of the problem and other people are not. And I think those concepts are newer for a lot of older people, but that doesn't mean that they can't learn them, because we're all kind of products of our time in a way. And then at the same time, as we were talking about before, there are people who participated in past social movements, say from the 1970s or the 1980s or the 60s. And, they sort of immediately understand the political dynamics as well. So I hesitate to say that young people have a monopoly on this. I don't think they do. I think it's always useful to think about that spectrum of persuasion in a social movement, where you have a lot of neutral people. You'll have a few active supporters, some passive supporters, and on the opposition side, you're going to have passive opponents and you're going to have active opponents. And a lot of people can be persuaded, and it's useful. And not everybody will be persuaded to become an active supporter. You can sometimes move somebody from being a passive opponent to being neutral, and that is valuable on a large scale. There are some people who their vested interests in the fossil fuel industry or their ideology is so unchangeable that you cannot persuade them and you have to beat them. That's sort of my, philosophy. I'm not saying that is definitely correct, but that's how I view it.
Actually, I did see that our alumnus from the 60s who protested against the Vietnam War is watching, so that's great. so spanning decades. Someone has just said, it's a comment, but this sort of ties into what we're saying about maybe the reality of a lot of PhD students is, I want to do this research, and the only funding that's available to me is from a fossil fuel company. So I'm up against a wall. I have no choice. What's the situation there?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think life has a lot of gray areas. I'll give an example of myself. When I was at Harvard, a lot of my research was funded by the military, even though, I oppose a lot of our military actions abroad personally. It's sort of a different issue, but so there's a lack of purity there, if you want to think of it that way. And I think that's just sort of reality. Now we try to improve things, we try to change things, and we try to make a difference where we can and when we can. And again, that's sort of my personal philosophy. But yes, I mean, one of my good colleagues, good friends, he was actually funded by the oil industry to do his PhD research. And at the same time, he was a very active divestment activist. So there are contradictions, but I think, it's important to try to make a difference where you can, while realizing that you cannot completely extract yourself from a problematic situation all the time. Like,
the world is messy, and really,
mm-hmm.
Perfection is hard to find. There is another idea that maybe what the divestment movement needs to also be doing is looking for donors and philanthropists who are, traditionally give to these universities to fund research. Maybe we need to be looking for, where are the divestment philanthropists out there? Why are they not sponsoring a chair in truly renewable energy? So maybe that's, if anybody's out there watching, we're interested in that. Just also going back a little bit to this question of that vote that you had at Stanford, the faculty who voted against divestment, were they openly, can you say a little bit about what you learned from that recent vote? And the faculty voted it down. They voted against divestment. What was the situation there?
Yes. So this is about a month ago or 2 or 3 weeks ago. There was a faculty senate at Stanford meeting to discuss whether to support a resolution that had passed the student senate or the student government in support of divestment. And of course, the trustees were also considering the issue at the time. And as you mentioned, that resolution failed the faculty senate. And what were the numbers? Is it just pass fail, or do you actually know? Yes, I mean, there is a vote tally. I don't recall the exact vote, but I think it was something like 2-1 against, something like that. And many of the faculty on that body, they said during discussion, we're funded by the fossil fuel industry, we're funded by the oil industry, we don't want to cast them as bad actors. And again, I mean, this demonstrates how the funding has an effect. When you give somebody patronage of any kind, psychologically, they're going to think that you're a good actor. We know that from human social psychological experiments that happens. People are not always aware of it. And so just the very act of giving funding will generate goodwill for the industry, from the recipients of the money. So we were seeing that effect there. Now, since then, a larger body of the Stanford faculty convened. It's called the Academic Council, and it has more or less all of the faculty at Stanford on it. And they didn't have a quorum to take an official vote, but they did have a discussion, and almost everybody was in support of the divestment resolution. So, sometimes you see a certain body just because of who's on it, you'll get a certain result. But I think consistently what we've seen both at Stanford and at places like Harvard are that when you include everybody, when you include not just the people with a conflict of interest who are going to oppose it, but when you include everybody, then there's very high support for divestment. So again, another important point strategically to bring in many people into the discussion and not just confine it to the climate and energy researchers who themselves are receiving money from the industry.
Absolutely. Interesting. Okay. So this kind of goes back, the other thing, I mean, is there a way, it's difficult because it's almost a technical question. Someone was mentioning, how do we show the university? It's difficult to prove that the research topics are being influenced by the sponsor. But clearly that is something that is happening. And we heard a lot from Lynn Liu about engagement. They talk a lot about the need that if you divest, we have a particular problem at Princeton called disassociation. And this comes from the apartheid campaigns. And they said that what the company is doing has to be so bad that in addition to divesting from the company, we have to disassociate from it completely, which there's a coherence. If they're so terrible, then we shouldn't have anything to do with them. But obviously, in terms of fossil fuel companies, you know, there are a lot of things that is the only way at this moment that you can still, you know, function is by still using some of their products. So the university has said we can't disassociate from them. So therefore, we want to engage with them. And if we can't disassociate and we engage, there's no reason to divest. That makes no sense. So, but engagement to us seems like a frank failure. But how do you convince an institution that engagement isn't having any impact?
Yes. Well, I think you can demonstrate that engagement hasn't worked. You know, engagement sort of presumes that the industry is lacking information, that they just need to be given the right information and then they'll make the right decision. And of course, what the historical documents have shown is that the industry has never lacked information about the problem for decades. In fact, sometimes the information it's had is better than what outsiders have had. So the whole theory behind engagement is flawed in that way. And then you can look at empirically, has it worked? People have been trying to engage with the fossil fuel industry for a very long time, for decades. People go to shareholder meetings. They try to get the resolutions passed. It's a very weak lever. It hasn't worked. And it's not to say that engagement is always a bad idea all the time in sort of our corporate world. But in this case, it simply hasn't worked. And it's going to be very hard to convince a fossil fuel company not to be a fossil fuel company, or actually impossible to do that. So, you know, I mean, I think the case is really strong that engagement is not a promising direction. Now, will you convince the trustees to reject that approach if they're using it as a deflection tool? Maybe not, but you can convince everybody else who's watching that they're just stalling, and you know, that's how you generate pressure on them to finally change. And I wanted to make another point too, which is that, you know, there are multiple reasons to divest. There's not just one reason. So you mentioned the disassociation policy, where a company has to be so abhorrent that if you divest, then you have to sever all relationships with them. Now, if the case is made that these companies fit that criteria, or those criteria, then, you know, one can do that. And, you know, personally, I think there's a strong case to be made there too. But one can also just simply say, look, regardless of whether you think these companies are abhorrent, we know that we have to draw down our fossil fuel investments to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's just sort of a matter of fact. And if you support the Paris Agreement, then you should follow through with your actions. And so that's a separate justification for divesting, and they can both be valid at the same time. But, you know, you don't have to get into this. I think the whole disassociation policy, which is sort of unique to Princeton, what it does is it creates creates such a high bar that it's almost impossible to meet that bar, you know, and you could spend a lot of time trying to do that. So, but that's, you know, that's not the only reason to divest.
There are a lot of reasons to divest. And we've now reached our time limit. Thank you so much, Ben. This has been incredibly illuminating. It just gave us a new lens to look at this entire question with Exxon and what's happening in other universities. So thank you so much. And for the people who are watching, next week on Wednesday at 5:30, we will have another Divest Princeton talk, a different standard for Standard Oil, how divestment offered a new way at the Rockefeller Fund. So this will be another deep dive into money and fossil fuels with Stephen Heinz, the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Family Foundation and a leader of the Divest Invest movement. For those of you who are younger, Standard Oil was owned by the Rockefeller family and was broken up into many companies, which became Exxon, Chevron, Amoco, a number of companies, and basically made the Rockefeller Family Foundation incredibly rich, made the family so rich that they created a foundation. So the fact that they divested is incredibly, as Ben said, it's symbolic and it's also really materially meaningful. So we'll be learning about that next week. So thank you again, Ben. And we look forward to seeing the next piece you write. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Great.